The hospital corridors felt different now. The security guard walked through them not in his old uniform, but in a well-fitted suit, his new ID badge reflecting his position as head of security. The emergency room entrance where he'd spent so many nights was buzzing with activity, but this time he wasn't here for work. When he arrived at the maternity ward, Tom was pacing outside the delivery room, his usual confident businessman demeanor replaced by nervous excitement. "She's asking for you," Tom said, relief flooding his face. "Both of you, actually," he added as the guard's wife hurried down the hallway, still carrying the flowers they'd bought on the way. Inside, the doctor who he'd saved that night months ago was holding her newborn daughter, tears of joy streaming down her face. The baby was tiny and perfect, wrapped in a soft pink blanket. The room was filled with that special kind of quiet that comes only in life's most precious moments. "Come meet your namesake," she said softly. "We named her Hope because that's what you gave us that night. And her middle name is Joy, after your wife, who's been such a wonderful friend these past months." The security guard's wife gasped softly beside him, squeezing his hand. They'd grown close to this family over the past months, sharing dinners, celebrating his daughter's academic achievements, and watching as both their lives transformed in unexpected ways. "Would you like to hold her?" the doctor asked. Carefully, she placed baby Hope in his arms. As he looked down at the tiny face, he remembered that rainy night in the parking garage. One split-second decision had led to all of this: a new career, his daughter's education secured, and now this precious new life he'd helped protect before she was even born. Tom wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, watching the scene with misty eyes. "You know, I've been thinking," he said. "We're expanding the security program to other hospitals in the city. We need someone to oversee the whole healthcare division." The security guard looked up, surprised. Even after months of successes in his new role, moments like this still amazed him. From night guard to citywide security director, all because he'd chosen to help someone in need. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his daughter. She'd just aced her engineering finals and was heading to her internship interview. "Love you, Dad," the message read. "Thanks for teaching me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing the right thing even when you're scared." Baby Hope stirred in his arms, making those tiny noises that newborns make. The doctor watched them with tired but happy eyes, her hand resting on her husband's arm. The room felt full of possibility, of lives intertwined by fate and kindness. Later that evening, as he and his wife drove home in the Mercedes that had started it all, they passed the hospital parking garage. The new security lights made it bright as day, and he could see two guards making their rounds, guards he trained himself. The place that had once held fear for so many was now a symbol of safety and change. "You know what I keep thinking about?" his wife asked softly. "That night, when you ran toward danger instead of away from it, you weren't just saving one person. You were changing the future for so many people. That baby girl will grow up knowing her life started with an act of courage. Your daughter will build amazing things because you showed her what integrity looks like. Those scholarship students will help others because you showed them what generosity means." He smiled, thinking about baby Hope and all the hope she represented. Sometimes the smallest choices create the biggest ripples. A security guard doing his job, a businessman choosing gratitude over greed, a doctor turning fear into positive change, small moments that transformed not just their lives, but their entire community. As they turned onto their street, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, he was simply grateful for this moment, for the chance to be part of something bigger than himself, and for the reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope and joy can be born. 1 month later, the security guard stood in his new office, still getting used to wearing a suit instead of a uniform. The view from the 20th floor showed the whole city spread out below, including the hospital where he'd worked for so many years. His old security badge sat framed on his desk, a reminder of where this journey began. His first major project as head of security was already underway. The hospital parking garage was being completely transformed. New lights had been installed, security cameras covered every corner, and a team of trained guards now patrolled around the clock. No one would ever have to feel unsafe there again. "Sir, your 9 a.m. meeting is ready," his assistant called from the doorway. Even after a month, being called sir still felt strange. He grabbed his tablet. another new thing to get used to, and headed to the conference room. Inside, his team of security managers waited. These were experienced professionals from all of Tom's properties, but they listened to him with respect. They knew his story, how he'd earned this position not through connections or degrees, but through pure character and courage. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice confident now after weeks of practice. "Today we're reviewing the new safety protocols for all residential buildings." He looked around the room, remembering his own days of patrols and night shifts. "Remember, we're not just protecting properties, we're protecting people's homes, their families, their dreams." After the meeting, he had lunch with Tom in the building's fancy cafeteria. These regular meetings had become a highlight of his week. Tom wasn't just his boss, he'd become a friend, someone who truly understood the value of doing the right thing. "The hospital board approved all our security upgrades," Tom mentioned between bites. "And my wife says the night shift nurses are already feeling safer. You've made a real difference there." The security guard smiled, thinking about Mrs. Rodriguez and the other nurses he used to greet every night. "Speaking of your wife, how is she doing?" "Ready to deliver any day now," Tom beamed. "She insists you and your family be there when the baby comes, says she won't have it any other way." Later that afternoon, he drove home in the Mercedes that still turned heads in his neighborhood. But the biggest changes weren't about the car or the suit or the office. They were about the little things. His daughter was thriving in her engineering classes now that she could focus on studying instead of juggling multiple jobs. She'd even started mentoring other students, paying forward the blessings she'd received. The scholarship in his name had already helped 3 other hardworking students pursue their dreams. His wife had cut back on her teaching hours, finally able to start the after-school art program she'd always dreamed about. Their home was filled with children's paintings now, bright splashes of color that seemed to reflect how their lives had changed. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed Mrs. Wilson watering her plants as usual. But now she was proudly wearing one of the safety whistles his new program had distributed throughout the neighborhood. Small changes, rippling outward, making the world a little bit safer, a little bit better. Inside, he hung his suit jacket carefully and sat in his favorite chair. The evening news was playing, and a story caught his eye. The hospital was being recognized for its innovative security improvements, but it wasn't the recognition that made him smile. It was knowing that somewhere out there, someone else was walking safely to their car tonight because of changes he'd helped make happen. His phone buzzed, a text from Tom. "Emergency meeting tomorrow. My wife's in labor. Time to meet your newest security client." He smiled, remembering that night in the parking garage. Sometimes the biggest changes in life come from the smallest decisions, like choosing to run toward danger instead of away from it. Later that morning, after the excitement about the Mercedes had somewhat settled, the security guard finally checked his email. His daughter had insisted on showing him how to set up email on his phone months ago, though he rarely used it. Today, though, a new message was waiting, one that would change everything. The subject line read, "A new opportunity, more than just thanks." His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, his wife and daughter huddled close on their worn living room couch to read along with him. The email started formally but quickly turned personal. It was from Tom, the businessman whose wife he'd helped last night. The words on the screen seemed almost impossible to believe. Head of security position. Overseeing safety for all properties in the city's largest real estate company. The salary mentioned made him blink several times to make sure he was reading it right. That's 3 times what you make now," his wife whispered, gripping his arm. She was still in her teaching clothes, having just returned from morning classes at the elementary school. But it was the next paragraph that made his daughter burst into tears. A full scholarship, not just covering her remaining engineering courses, but including graduate school if she wanted it, plus a guaranteed internship at one of the city's top firms. "Dad," she choked out, "do you know what this means? I won't have to work 3 jobs anymore. I can actually focus on my studies. I can." He pulled her close, his own eyes getting misty. For years, he'd watched her struggle, trying to balance her classes with long hours of work. He'd felt helpless, knowing his salary could only stretch so far. Now suddenly, her dreams were within reach. His wife was reading ahead in the email, her hand covering her mouth. "There's more," she said softly. They're starting a scholarship fund in your name at the college for other students who show extraordinary character and dedication to helping others. The security guard sat back, overwhelmed. Just 12 hours ago, he'd been doing his regular rounds, just another night shift like thousands before it. Now here he was, sitting in his living room, a new Mercedes parked outside, and an email that promised to change not just his life, but the lives of countless students he'd never meet. "I need to call them," he said finally. "This is too much. I can't accept." His daughter grabbed his hand. "Dad, stop. Remember what you always told me about how helping others isn't just the right thing to do, it's the only thing to do." She wiped her eyes, smiling now. "Maybe it's time you let someone help you for a change." His wife nodded, pulling out her phone. "And you need to call the hospital. Let them know you won't be coming in tonight." She paused, then added with a small smile, "Head of security needs his rest before starting his new job." Just then, another email notification popped up on his phone. This one was from the college's dean, congratulating his daughter on her scholarship and mentioning something about a special ceremony. As he read it, he could hardly believe how much had changed since last night. His daughter was already calling her friends, happy tears still streaming down her face. His wife was making plans for a celebration dinner. And there he sat, a simple security guard who'd just tried to do the right thing, watching as one small act of courage rippled out to touch so many lives. The Mercedes outside gleamed in the late morning sun, but somehow it didn't seem as important anymore. What mattered was the joy in his daughter's eyes, the pride in his wife's smile, and the knowledge that sometimes, when you least expect it, life has a way of showing you that every act of kindness matters. The morning sun was just peeking over the horizon when the security guard finally turned onto his street after the longest night shift of his life. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but his mind kept replaying the events in the parking garage. He'd called his wife earlier to tell her he'd be a little late. No need to worry her with the details of what happened. Something wasn't right, though. As he got closer to his house, he noticed an unfamiliar glint of silver catching the morning light. At first, he thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, there was definitely a brand new Mercedes-Benz parked right in front of his house, complete with a big red bow on the hood. He pulled his old pickup truck to a stop, staring at the luxury car in disbelief. It looked completely out of place on his modest street, where most cars were at least a decade old. For a moment, he wondered if he'd somehow driven to the wrong house, but there was his familiar front porch with the swing his wife loved so much. As he got out of his truck, his neighbor Mrs. Wilson was already outside in her bathrobe, watering her plants and trying not to look too obvious about staring at the Mercedes. "It arrived about an hour ago," she called out. Two men in suits brought it. They seemed very professional. His hands were shaking slightly as he approached the car. There was an envelope tucked under one of the windshield wipers. He opened it carefully, almost afraid of what he might find inside. The note was written on expensive paper with a company letterhead he recognized from the business card he'd received last night. "To the man who saved 2 lives last night," he read quietly to himself. "Your courage and kindness deserve more than just a car, but this is a start. The keys are in the envelope. This is not a loan or a lease, it's yours. Consider it a small token of our gratitude, the family you protected." He had to read the note 3 times before the words really sank in. The keys were indeed in the envelope, heavy and solid in his hand, with that distinct Mercedes logo catching the morning light. This had to be some kind of dream. Maybe he'd fallen asleep at his desk during his shift. Just then, his wife opened the front door, still in her pajamas. "Honey, what's going on? Whose car is?" Her voice trailed off as she saw his face and the note in his hand. "Remember that pregnant doctor I told you about? The one from last night?" His voice was barely a whisper. Her husband, he couldn't finish the sentence, just handed her the note. His wife read it, her hand covering her mouth in surprise. "But this car, it must cost more than I make in 3 years," he finished for her. They both stood there in silence, staring at the gleaming vehicle. "You deserve this," his wife finally said, squeezing his hand. "You're always helping others, never asking for anything in return. Maybe it's time someone did something for you." He shook his head, still struggling to process it all. "I was just doing my job. Anyone would have." "No," his wife interrupted firmly. Not anyone would have run toward danger to help a stranger. That's who you are. That's who you've always been. Their daughter's excited voice suddenly came from the doorway. Dad, is that a Mercedes? She was supposed to be at her early morning study group at the college, but apparently the sight of a luxury car in their driveway was enough to delay her plans. As his family gathered around him, examining the car with a mix of disbelief and joy, the security guard felt overwhelmed. Not by the expensive gift, but by the realization that sometimes doing the right thing had a way of coming back to you in ways you never expected. Little did he know, the Mercedes was just the beginning. The real surprise was still sitting in his email inbox, unread, an offer that would change not just his life, but his entire family's future. The sun wasn't even up yet when Tom made his first phone call. He sat in his home office, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, and a determined look on his face. His wife was finally sleeping upstairs after the terrifying events of last night, but he couldn't rest. Not yet. I need that Mercedes, he said into the phone. The silver one we looked at last week. Yes, I know what time it is. I'll pay extra for immediate delivery. He hung up and immediately dialed another number. This time, it was his company's head of security. I want everything you can find out about the night security guard at City Memorial Hospital. Not the bad stuff. I want to know about his family, his dreams, what kind of man he is. Tom rubbed his tired eyes, but his mind was crystal clear. When you build a real estate empire from nothing, you learn that timing is everything. By sunrise, Tom had a plan. The Mercedes dealer was already preparing the car, a beautiful machine that cost more than what the security guard made in 3 years. But that was just the beginning. Tom had bigger plans, much bigger. The report about the guard came in through email. Everything confirmed what Tom had already guessed. A good man working hard to give his family a better life. 15 years at the same job, never missed a shift. A daughter in college studying engineering, a wife who taught at the local elementary school. No fancy vacations, no luxury purchases, just steady payments on a modest house and a college fund that was stretched thin. Tom smiled as he read the report. This was exactly the kind of person he'd been looking for to head security across all his properties. Someone with real experience, genuine care for others, and unquestionable integrity. The kind of person who'd run toward danger to help a stranger. By 7 a.m., the pieces were falling into place. The Mercedes was being detailed one last time before delivery. Tom's assistant had already drafted the job offer, a position that would triple the guard's current salary. But there was more. Tom had also called the college where the guard's daughter studied. Full scholarship, starting immediately, he told the dean, an old friend. And I'm setting up an endowment in the security guard's name for future students who show the same kind of character. His wife found him in the office just as he finished making the arrangements. She looked better after some sleep, but he could still see the shadows under her eyes. "What are you doing up so early?" she asked, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. Tom stood up and hugged her gently. "Making things right," he said simply. "That man didn't just save you and our baby last night. He showed us something important. That there are still people willing to do the right thing, no matter what." His wife looked at the papers on his desk, her eyes widening as she realized what he was planning. The Mercedes? Just the beginning, Tom smiled. "I'm offering him a job. Head of security for all our properties. Someone who'd risk his life for a stranger is exactly who we need." Tears welled up in his wife's eyes, but this time they were happy tears. "He mentioned his daughter's studying engineering," she said softly. "He was so proud, talking about how hard she works." "Already taken care of," Tom assured her. "Full scholarship, plus some extra surprises." He checked his watch. "The car should be arriving at his house right about now. I had them park it right out front with a note." His wife hugged him tight. "You're a good man, Tom," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, I'm just someone who recognizes goodness when I see it. That security guard, he's the real hero. We're just making sure he gets the life he deserves." As the morning sun filled their home with warm light, Tom couldn't help but smile. Sometimes life gives you a chance to do something truly meaningful. Today was one of those days, and he wasn't going to waste it. Inside the warm hospital lobby, Dr. Lee's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Even after 20 minutes, her heart was still racing from what had just happened in the parking garage. She sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, sipping the hot tea the kind security guard had brought her, trying to calm her nerves. She was supposed to be delivering babies tonight, not almost becoming another crime statistic. As head of the maternity ward, she'd stayed late reviewing patient files, something she did almost every night. But tonight was different. Tonight could have gone horribly wrong if it wasn't for that security guard. The police had just finished taking her statement. They'd been professional, but didn't give her much hope about catching the men who attacked her. But right now, she wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about her baby, her hand resting protectively over her 8-month pregnant belly. She felt a kick and finally managed a small smile. At least someone was telling her everything would be okay. Her husband Tom's worried voice echoed through the lobby as he rushed in, still wearing his business suit from a late meeting. "Are you all right, the baby?" he asked, kneeling beside her chair, his hands joining hers on her belly. The worry in his eyes made her start crying again. "We're both fine," she managed to say between sobs. "The security guard, he saved us. If he hadn't been there," she couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Tom held her close, and she could feel him trembling too. The security guard stood quietly nearby, giving them space while still keeping watch. He'd refused to leave until her husband arrived, even though his shift had ended 15 minutes ago. Dr. Lai watched as Tom walked over to thank him, but the guard just shook his head humbly. "Just doing my job, sir," he said, but Tom wouldn't let it go at that. He took out one of his business cards, the fancy ones with the gold trim that showed he owned one of the city's biggest real estate companies. "You didn't just do your job," Tom said firmly. "You saved my family. I want to properly thank you." The guard seemed embarrassed by the attention, but he took the card after Tom insisted. As they drove home that night, Dr. Lay couldn't stop thinking about how differently things could have turned out. She thought about all the nights she'd walked up her car alone, about all the other doctors and nurses who did the same. Something needed to change. "Tom," she said suddenly, breaking the silence in their car, "I want to do something, not just for the guard, but for the whole hospital. The parking garage needs better lighting, more cameras. We need to make it safer." Tom glanced at her, then back at the road. She could see the wheels turning in his head. He had that look he got when a big idea was forming. "I think I know exactly what to do," he said finally. "But first, we need to thank the man who was brave enough to step up when it mattered most." That night, Dr. Lay couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those men in the parking garage. But then she remembered the strong, confident voice that had scared them away, and she'd feel safe again. She thought about the guard, how he'd turned down their thanks like it was nothing special. She remembered the way he'd talked about his daughter while they waited for Tom to arrive. How proud he was that she'd gotten into college, how worried he was about paying for it. A man who'd risk his life for a stranger, who worked night shifts to give his daughter a better future, that was someone special. As she finally drifted off to sleep, her hand resting on her belly where their baby girl was kicking, Dr. Lay knew tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she and Tom would find a way to change someone's life, just like that brave security guard had changed theirs. Little did she know, Tom was already awake in his home office, making calls and pulling strings. By morning, he'd set in motion a plan that would do more than just thank one brave man. It would change the lives of everyone involved in ways they couldn't imagine. Only then did he turn to the woman, who was trembling but standing strong. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently, noticing how she still held her stomach protectively. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "My baby. I was so scared they would." She couldn't finish the sentence, but James understood. He picked up her glasses from the ground, thankfully unbroken, and handed them back to her. "You're safe now," he said softly, the way he talked to his own daughter when she was scared. "Let's get you inside where it's warm. We'll file a report, and I'll make sure you get to your car safely from now on." As they walked back toward the hospital entrance, James didn't know that this simple act of kindness would change his life forever. He was just doing his job, being the person he'd always tried to be. But sometimes, that's all it takes to set something extraordinary in motion. The old clock on the hospital wall ticked past midnight as James made his usual rounds through the dimly lit corridors of City Memorial Hospital. After working here as a security guard for 15 years, he knew every corner, every squeaky door, and every flickering light that needed fixing. The night shift was usually quiet, just the way he liked it, giving him time to think about his daughter's college dreams and how he'd make them come true. Rain pattered against the windows, creating shadows that danced across the empty hallways. James pulled his jacket closer, feeling thankful for the warm building compared to the bitter cold outside. He just finished his coffee, the same cheap stuff from the vending machine that he'd grown used to over the years. His wife always told him to bring coffee from home, but somehow he never remembered. Tonight felt different though. Maybe it was the storm getting worse, or maybe it was just one of those feelings you get but can't explain. James had learned to trust his gut over the years. It had saved him more than once during his time in security. As he walked past the emergency room entrance, he nodded to the tired nurses changing shifts. They were good people, working just as hard as him to keep this place running. One of them, Mrs. Rodriguez, waved at him like she always did. "Quiet night?" she asked with a knowing smile. "So far," James replied, knocking on the wooden desk for luck. That's when he heard it, a sound that made his heart skip a beat. At first it was faint, almost lost in the rhythm of the rain. But then it came again, clearer this time, a scream from the parking garage. James didn't hesitate. 15 years of training kicked in as he sprinted toward the sound, his boots echoing through the empty corridors. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he pushed through the heavy doors into the garage. The cold air hit him like a wall, but he barely noticed it. The screams were louder now, bouncing off the concrete walls. James's heart pounded in his chest as he ran between the parked cars, following the sound. His hand reached for his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. The parking garage was huge, 5 levels of darkness and shadows where anything could happen. That's when he saw them, 2 men in dark hoodies cornering a woman behind a white SUV. The woman was clearly pregnant, her hands protectively wrapped around her belly as she backed away from them. Her doctor's coat was torn at the sleeve, and her glasses had fallen to the ground. James could see her shaking, could hear the fear in her voice as she begged them to leave her alone. One of the men had a knife, its blade catching the dim light from the overhead fluorescence. The other was reaching for her purse, but James could tell they wanted more than just money. Time seemed to slow down. James had been trained for moments like this, but training was one thing, real life was another. He thought about his own daughter, about how he'd want someone to help her if she was ever in trouble. Without even realizing it, he was already moving forward. "Sis, you alright?" His voice boomed through the garage, stronger and more confident than he felt inside. "Step away from her now." The flashlight beam hit the men directly in their faces, momentarily blinding them. James's other hand was already calling for backup on his radio, giving his location in clear, practiced words. The 2 men hesitated, clearly not expecting anyone to show up. James used their moment of uncertainty to his advantage, closing the distance between them. He was a big man. Years of working security had kept him fit despite his age. His presence alone was often enough to deter trouble, and tonight was no different. "Police are on their way," he said firmly, even though he only just made the call. "You've got about 2 minutes to disappear before this gets really bad for you." He could see them weighing their options, the knife in the first man's hand wavering slightly. The pregnant woman took this chance to scramble away from them, moving behind James. He could hear her breathing, quick and scared, but she was safe now. That's all that mattered. Finally, the men made their choice. The one with the knife cursed, and they both turned and ran, their footsteps echoing through the garage until they disappeared into the night. James kept his flashlight trained on them until he couldn't see them anymore, making sure they were really gone.